I'm done pretending you're enough for me, Marcus. Julian is a real man, an upgrade. Do you understand what that word means? Make sure to sign the divorce paper as soon as possible. I'm done with your miserable life.
I'd spent 11 years answering to a name that wasn't mine, Janitor, because I needed to know, once and for all, if the woman beside me loved the man or the money. I'd built an entire second identity just to find out. I hadn't planned on how far she'd go to prove me right.
I said nothing. I just stood there in my coveralls, mop in hand, while Julian slid an arm around my wife's waist and looked at me the way a man looks at something he's already thrown away. Here's what neither of them understood. The maroon blazer Julian was so proud of had been bought with money that ran through an account I controlled. The title he wore like a medal existed because I'd created it, funded it, and quietly watched every move he made since the day I hired him. Not to fall in love with Cynthia, but to prove he never would. He broke that rule the moment his greed got louder than the contract. He just hadn't found out yet what it was going to cost him. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the quiet person in the room and wondered how long it takes for the truth to catch up to them, hit subscribe and drop the country you're watching from in the comments. I want to know exactly how far this one travels. Now let me take you back to the year I decided the only way to find real love was to disappear inside a lie. I met Cynthia on a Thursday in late September, at a laundromat 2 blocks from an apartment I no longer needed but still paid rent on, because a billionaire showing up in a laundromat asks fewer questions than a billionaire showing up anywhere else. She was folding thrifted blouses, laughing at her phone, and when she looked up at me, she didn't do the thing every other woman had done for years. The quick scan of my watch, my shoes, the keys I never let anyone see. She just smiled at me like I was a person. I told her my name was Marcus, that I worked maintenance for a property company downtown. True, in the sense that I owned the company and every building it managed. What I never told her was the number attached to my name, because I'd already learned what that number did to people. I wanted, once, to be chosen for nothing. She chose me. We married in a courthouse with 12 guests, and for 3 years, she never once flinched at the coveralls. I never stopped taking care of her. I just learned to do it invisibly. When her mother's surgery blew a hole through her savings, an anonymous hospital fund quietly absorbed the balance before the bill ever reached her. When she talked, wistfully, about a boutique she'd never have the capital for, an unnamed investor appeared 18 months later with exactly the number she needed. I never signed my name to any of it. I told myself it didn't matter whether she knew, that loving her well was enough, even from the shadows. It wasn't enough for her to notice what was missing, though. The pressure came from her phone, other people's vacations, other people's husbands with cars wrapped in bows. She started asking why I still wore the same 3 shirts, why Denise's husband made partner, while I came home smelling like bleach. I could have ended it in a sentence. Instead, I stayed quiet and kept fixing things anonymously, because some stubborn part of me still needed to know, was it me she'd stopped wanting, or just the coveralls? By the 5th year, the questions turned to contempt, stated out loud in front of guests like I wasn't in the room. I kept sending help she never traced back to me. An anonymous scholarship for her cousin, a quietly forgiven debt for her father's failing shop. I never asked for credit. I told myself a man who truly loved someone didn't need to be thanked for it. Some nights I lay awake, wondering if all that invisible devotion amounted to anything at all, or if I'd simply built a more comfortable cage for both of us. I didn't know yet that the answer to my old question, did she love the man or the money, was about to arrive wearing a maroon blazer and carrying an offer letter I myself would sign. Arthur Pendleton had worked for me 11 years and learned never to ask why. He asked once, when I called him into the penthouse at 10 at night, and the look on my face answered better than words. I need someone hired, I said, back to the window. Not through HR, through you. Ambitious, hungry, good-looking. His real assignment is Cynthia. You want to test her. I want the truth. Before I sign anything that ends this marriage, I need to know if there's anything left worth saving, or if I've spent 11 years quietly propping up a woman who was only ever waiting for a better offer. And if it's the second one, then I need it documented. No ambiguity. What are the rules? He gets close. He never touches her. The moment he does, the contract's void. Every cent stops, and he's finished in this city. Arthur found Julian Sterling within the week. 31. Sharp-suited. Hungry in the specific way of a man who'd spent his life one rung below the room he wanted. Julian read the contract twice, asked what happened if he broke it, and smiled at the answer. Total ruin, no recourse. I don't break contracts, he said, signing with a flourish. Arthur believed him until Julian asked, almost as an afterthought, what the husband did for a living. Maintenance, Arthur told him. Nothing to worry about. Arthur described it to me later, something shifting behind Julian's eyes, a quiet recalculation, an obstacle deciding it wasn't one. He didn't mention it to me right away. A flicker wasn't proof. I wouldn't need proof for long. Julian met Cynthia at a gala I sponsored every autumn, introduced himself as a rising director, and she lit up like he was the first interesting thing that had happened to her in years. I wasn't in the room, but I know exactly how it went, because I read every report afterward. He was patient. He let her talk, and within the hour, unprompted, she brought up her husband. He's sweet, she said, swirling wine his firm was paying for, but he cleans buildings for a living. Do you know what that's like? Watching everyone else's life get bigger while yours stays exactly the same size. Julian filed it away like a winning hand. Over the following weeks, he learned everything about the man he was supposed to be careful of, and none of it worried him. I drove a used sedan, wore the same steel watch, said maybe 4 words at dinner. Cynthia complained about me constantly, and constantly armed him with confidence. He's happy being nothing, she told him, and he nodded, said she deserved better, watched her lean into it like water after a drought. By the 8th week, the contract's one rule had stopped feeling like a boundary to him, and started feeling like an inconvenience written by people who didn't understand what he was capable of. He told himself he was still in control. But every time Cynthia looked at him the way she used to look at other women's wedding photos, something in his chest wanted more than the money. One night, standing outside her door while she laughed at something he'd said, Julian made a decision that had nothing to do with any contract. A decision that felt, to him, like claiming something he'd already won. Julian told himself 3 lies that night, each smaller than the last. It wouldn't count if it only happened once. No anonymous employer would ever find out about a private evening in her home, and even if I did, there was nothing a broke janitor's marriage could do to a man in his position. Afterward, lying in a bedroom that belonged to me without his knowing it, he felt nothing like guilt. Cynthia curled against his shoulder, murmuring that she couldn't remember the last time I had made her feel like anything at all. He'll never know, Julian said. Even if he did, she laughed. What's he going to do? Mop me to death? He laughed too, certain the anonymous boss was just some eccentric rich man running a strange experiment, and that he'd simply collected a bonus nobody had accounted for. He never thought about the smart lock system quietly logging every guest who crossed that threshold after midnight. He never thought about the mail on Cynthia's kitchen table, addressed to M. Vance, a name he'd once glanced at and dismissed, because he'd never bothered to ask what it meant. He had no idea a timestamp had just been generated with his name attached to it, and that the countdown on everything he thought he'd won had already started. 3 weeks later, Cynthia stopped hiding. She wanted me to feel exactly how small I was, so she waited for me in the courtyard, dressed in red, Julian beside her in his maroon blazer. I want a divorce, she said before I'd closed the car door. I've found someone who actually knows how to be a man. An upgrade. I said nothing. I'd spent years quietly wiring money to people she loved without ever once asking her to be grateful for me, and she still couldn't see me standing in front of her. You're an embarrassment, she said, finger jabbing my chest. A grown man who mops floors. Julian doesn't need to borrow dignity from anyone. Julian smiled the smile of a man who believed he'd already won a fight the other side didn't know they were in. No hard feelings, he said, hand extended. She just needed someone who matched her ambition. Nothing personal, I repeated quietly, picking up the divorce papers off the hood where she'd thrown them, folding them once without reading a line. I looked at him a moment longer than necessary, then walked into the house alone, while behind me, her laughter rose into the cold October air, the same laughter that had never once wondered where her mother's hospital bill had actually gone. Arthur was waiting in the penthouse when I came in. "Tell me," I said, dropping the papers on the desk. He turned the laptop around. A timestamp, a floor, a guest log. 3 weeks ago, Cynthia Vance. Didn't leave until 6 the next morning. I stared at it a long time. I thought of every anonymous transfer I'd made over 11 years. The boutique investor, the forgiven debt, the scholarship with no name attached. None of it ever traced back to me. All of it apparently worth less than a stranger's blazer. "He broke it in the first month," I said. "He still thinks it's a rich man's game he got away with," Arthur said. What I felt wasn't anger. It was the hollow relief of finally having an answer to the question I'd spent 11 years too afraid to ask, and too generous to stop funding in the meantime. "Pull his file," I said. "Everything, and find out when the next board presentation is. 11 days. Julian's leading it." I almost smiled. Good. Let him get comfortable up there. Julian had never felt more certain of his own trajectory. He told Cynthia 3 times over dinner that this presentation was the moment he stopped being the fast-tracked hire and became the name people had to reckon with. Arthur kept me posted on all of it. She'd moved into his tower 2 weeks earlier, already telling friends she was finally living the life she deserved. She planned to watch from the gallery. He wanted an audience for the man he'd built. He rehearsed obsessively, requested the largest boardroom, the one with the mahogany doors and the skyline view, because a room like that made a man look permanent. What he never once thought to check was who the board actually answered to, a chairman whose name appeared on no document, who had personally approved this exact date. He kissed her goodbye and left believing the future belonged entirely to him. He had 11 hours left to believe that. I let him get 4 sentences into his opening before I opened the mahogany doors myself. I wore the bespoke 3-piece suit I hadn't touched in months, 2 attorneys flanking me. I watched his face catch up half a second behind his eyes. The lobby, the mop, the coveralls he'd mocked for months, colliding with the man standing in front of him now. "Sorry to interrupt," I said. "I wanted to be here personally. This is a closed session. I don't know who let you." He turned toward the door. "Security. Can someone escort?" He never finished. Every board member in the room rose to their feet. "Chairman Vance," the presiding director said, extending a hand. I watched Julian's mind collapse the calculation in real time. Chairman, Vance, colliding with a surname he'd once glanced at on a kitchen table and never bothered to question. In the gallery, Cynthia's hand rose to her mouth, and I watched her own arithmetic run faster and crueler than his. 11 years of a man who came home smelling of bleach, who'd never once corrected her when she called him small, who she now understood had been quietly paying for things in her life she never thought to ask about. 6 months ago, I said, I authorized a contract with one condition. Mr. Sterling was never permitted to touch my wife. He broke it in the first month. I have the documentation. Her glass shattered against the floor, loud enough that half the room turned, and for the first time, I watched her understand exactly how small she had made herself look in front of a man who'd never once needed her gratitude to keep taking care of her. Effective immediately, Mr. Sterling is terminated for fraud and breach of contract. Every asset attached to his position reverts to the company now. Marcus, her voice cracked from the gallery. I didn't know who he was. You didn't need to know who he was, I said, looking at her for the first time since I'd walked in. You only needed to know who I was. You had 11 years and 100 quiet reasons I never asked you to notice. I turned to Julian. You told her I couldn't do anything to you. You were right about one thing. I never touched a hair on your head. I didn't have to. Security walked him out, and he didn't look back once. Not at her, not at the room. She followed him to the lobby anyway, calling his name, until he turned and looked at her the way he'd once looked at me in a courtyard, like something in his way. "This isn't my problem anymore," he said, and kept walking. I didn't need to watch the rest. I already knew. She'd stand alone in the lobby of a building she'd once mocked me for cleaning, finally understanding that the invisible hands that had quietly held her life together for 11 years belonged to the one man she'd never once thought to thank.